The Alexander brothers were the embodiment of success, the kind of individuals most people could only aspire to become. Born into a wealthy family, Daniel and Thomas were raised in luxury. Their home, a sprawling mansion perched atop a hill in the most prestigious area of town, was the pinnacle of affluence. From the outside, they had everything anyone could want: wealth, status, power, and connections to the most influential people in society. They were often seen attending elite social events, dining in the finest restaurants, and enjoying vacations in far-flung exotic locales. To those around them, Daniel and Thomas seemed untouchable, part of an exclusive world where the ordinary struggles of everyday life didn't exist. But as anyone who's watched the rise and fall of the rich and powerful knows, the life of privilege is often riddled with cracks that can't always be seen on the surface. Beneath the polished exterior of the Alexander brothers, the foundation of their empire was beginning to crumble. Friends, business partners, and even some family members began to notice subtle shifts in the brothers' behavior. Gone was the carefree attitude they once had. In its place was a growing sense of tension and unease. Daniel, the older brother, was always seen as the more composed and calculating of the two. He had taken the reins of the family business, overseeing investments, deals, and operations that spanned across multiple industries. But those who worked closely with him began to notice the change. His temper was shorter, his decisions more erratic, and his once strong leadership started to falter. Thomas, the younger brother, had always been more impulsive. He lived in the shadow of his older sibling, often overshadowed by Daniel's charismatic presence. But Thomas, too, was showing signs of stress, grappling with personal issues and a growing resentment toward his brother's control over their family's fortune. As the months passed, the cracks in the Alexander brothers' seemingly perfect lives widened. Their financial empire, once a symbol of stability, was starting to show signs of strain. The business that had propelled them to wealth was now riddled with debt, and rumors of shady dealings and conflicts with other powerful figures were swirling around them. What had once been a picture-perfect existence was now teetering on the edge of collapse. The brothers, trapped in a web of their own making, could feel the pressure mounting, an invisible force that was pushing them towards something dark, something they couldn't yet see but knew was coming. At the same time, tensions were rising within the family. The Alexander brothers had always been close, yet over time their relationship had grown more strained. They began to argue more frequently, unable to agree on how to handle the growing financial troubles and their worsening personal conflicts. Their interactions, once full of laughter and camaraderie, were now filled with sharp words, distrust, and resentment. And in the midst of it all, they were hiding secrets that would soon lead them to commit a crime that no one could have foreseen. It was supposed to be a routine gathering, a dinner party with a few close friends to unwind after a long week. For Daniel and Thomas, who were used to hosting lavish events with wine, gourmet food, and extravagant entertainment, this was nothing out of the ordinary. But the evening would unfold in a way no one could have imagined. A small disagreement, one that began as a simple disagreement between the brothers, would spiral into a violent, brutal confrontation that would shake the very core of their privileged lives. As guests arrived, the atmosphere seemed typical of an Alexander gathering. Greetings, small talk, and laughter filling the air. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the room. Daniel and Thomas, already on edge due to mounting financial pressures, found themselves embroiled in a heated argument. The topic of their dispute was nothing new. Money, their family business, the mounting pressure to maintain their status. But this time something snapped. Voices were raised, tempers flared, and what started as an argument between two brothers quickly escalated into an all-out fight. Witnesses at the dinner party later described the scene as chaotic and terrifying. Daniel and Thomas, their patience worn thin by stress, began shouting at each other, their words cutting through the room like knives. Friends and family tried to intervene, but the brothers, blinded by anger and resentment, refused to back down. As the argument reached a fever pitch, things took a turn for the worse. According to reports, it was Daniel who first raised his hand, a moment that would forever alter the course of the evening. The tension between the brothers had been building for months, but on that night it reached a breaking point. As Thomas stood up in anger, Daniel grabbed a nearby object, a sharp, heavy item, and struck his younger brother. The violence was shocking, sudden, and intense. In an instant, the room went silent, and those who had been laughing and enjoying the evening were now frozen in horror. Daniel's actions were swift and unforgiving. The force of the blow left Thomas lying on the ground, blood staining the floor beneath him. The friends and family who had gathered in the lavish mansion were left in stunned disbelief. No one could comprehend what had just happened. The Alexander brothers, men who had lived their lives in luxury, who had everything anyone could want, were now at the center of a brutal crime that no one could have predicted. The police were called, and by the time they arrived at the mansion, Daniel was standing over his brother's motionless body, surrounded by a room full of terrified guests. His calm demeanor and the blood on his hands painted a chilling picture. What had begun as an argument between two brothers had turned into a horrific act of violence. But the question lingered. Was this a momentary loss of control, or had the brothers' resentment toward one another finally reached its breaking point? The aftermath of the Alexander brothers' violent altercation sent shockwaves through the community and the media. The wealthy, powerful family that had once been admired by all was now embroiled in a scandal that would forever tarnish their legacy. The media quickly picked up the story, turning the brothers into national figures and casting a spotlight on their once impeccable reputations. Shocking crime in elite circle. Alexander brothers found guilty of violence at dinner party, read the headlines. The press couldn't get enough of the story. The very idea that two men so accustomed to luxury and privilege could descend into such barbarity was too compelling to ignore. News outlets dug deep into the brothers' background, uncovering personal conflicts, financial struggles, and long-held grievances that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Every detail was scrutinized: how the crime unfolded, the family's history, and the brothers' social circles. The media painted a picture of a broken family, torn apart by greed, jealousy, and resentment. The public watched as their every move was dissected, as their personal lives were exposed for all to see. Social media exploded with opinions on the crime, with some defending the brothers as victims of circumstance, while others called for the harshest possible punishment. As the trial approached, the Alexander brothers found themselves facing a battle not just for their freedom, but for their legacy. Their once admired family name had been tarnished beyond repair. How could they do this? One commentator asked. These brothers had everything: wealth, status, respect, and now they've thrown it all away. For what? The anger was palpable. There was no sympathy for the brothers, only judgment and disgust at the violent nature of their crime. But despite the outcry, the brothers continued to plead for bail, hoping for a chance to regain their freedom while awaiting trial. Their defense argued that they were not a flight risk and that they would comply with all legal proceedings. But the prosecution was unyielding, calling for the harshest possible sentence. This was no accident, the prosecutor stated. This was an act of violent rage, and the brothers must be held accountable. As the case continued to unfold, the questions only grew. How could such privileged individuals, with everything to lose, commit such a brutal crime? Was this a spontaneous act of violence, or had it been building for years? What drove the Alexander brothers to destroy everything they had worked for? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary crime. The Alexander brothers had crossed a line from which there was no return. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, a stark contrast to the lavish, carefree lifestyle that the Alexander brothers had once enjoyed. The public had been gripped by the shocking crime, and now, as Daniel and Thomas stood trial for the brutal act that would forever alter their lives, the room was filled with spectators eager to see what would unfold. The brothers, once untouchable in their world of luxury and privilege, now found themselves facing the consequences of a violent outburst that no one could have predicted. As the trial progressed, the evidence began to paint a disturbing picture of the two men: successful, wealthy, but deeply troubled by secrets they had kept hidden for years. The defense's strategy was simple yet effective. They wanted to portray Daniel and Thomas as victims of their own circumstances, pushed to the brink by the mounting pressure of their personal and professional lives. Their lawyers argued that the brothers had acted in self-defense, claiming that what began as a verbal argument escalated into a violent confrontation due to an external threat. The defense tried to depict the situation as one of panic, a momentary loss of control fueled by stress, and the fear that had been mounting in both brothers' lives for some time. But the prosecution wasn't so easily swayed. They painted a much darker picture, one of premeditation and simmering resentment that had been building up for years. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act, the prosecutor declared. This was a violent outburst years in the making. The Alexander brothers had been at odds for far too long, and that tension finally exploded in a fit of rage. The prosecution argued that while the brothers may have had reasons to feel frustrated, the deliberate violence they unleashed upon each other went far beyond what could be classified as a mere spontaneous act. One of the key pieces of evidence presented was the chaotic scene at the dinner party. While there were conflicting reports from witnesses, several guests testified that the argument between Daniel and Thomas was not a sudden eruption, but rather a long-standing feud that had spilled over into the open. There were reports of past disagreements and unresolved issues, disputes about money, control over their family's business empire, and personal grudges that had only deepened over time. The prosecution suggested that this history of conflict had set the stage for the violent altercation. The brothers, once united by their shared legacy, had grown to despise each other, their personal and professional rivalries creating a volatile situation. The details of the altercation itself were even more damning. Witnesses claimed that they had heard heated shouting, followed by the sound of furniture being overturned and the crashing of objects. What had begun as an argument over business decisions turned into an uncontrollable frenzy. In the heat of the moment, Daniel, the older of the two, had snapped. Several reports indicated that he had struck Thomas first, knocking him to the ground. The suddenness and brutality of the attack left everyone in the room stunned. What had seemed like a minor disagreement had escalated into an all-out brawl, with the brothers' raw emotions and pent-up anger pouring out in the most destructive way possible. The prosecution emphasized that this was no accident. They argued that Daniel had struck Thomas with the intent to harm him, perhaps to send a message or reassert control over their failing empire. They presented evidence of the brothers' emotional states leading up to the attack: mounting debts, the deteriorating condition of their business, and the growing realization that their once gilded life was crumbling. This wasn't just a fight. It was a manifestation of their desperate, repressed frustrations. They thought they could hide it behind their wealth, their status, the prosecutor said. But eventually, all the resentment, all the greed, all the lies, they couldn't hide it any longer. And they snapped. Meanwhile, the defense continued to argue that the brothers were simply victims of their own pressures. Their lawyer spoke at length about the strain of living under the microscope of public scrutiny, the demands of keeping their business afloat, and the fear of losing everything. These men were not born criminals, the defense attorney argued. They were born into a legacy that required them to be perfect, to perform without falter. They were forced to play roles that they could no longer maintain. The defense suggested that, given the intensity of the situation and their mental state, the brothers could not be held fully accountable for the violence that transpired. "This is not an ordinary crime," the attorney continued. "It is the result of years of pressure, of not being able to maintain the facade anymore." But as the trial unfolded, the most chilling part of the case began to emerge: how both brothers seemed eerily calm in the aftermath. Police reports noted that when they arrived at the scene, the brothers were found in a strange state of composure, almost detached from what had just occurred. Daniel was described as unusually calm, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, his hands shaking slightly but his face blank. Thomas, despite his injuries, appeared to show little emotion, almost as though he was numb to the events that had transpired. This unnerving lack of remorse or panic left investigators and the public in shock. How could two men who had just committed such a violent act appear so unaffected by it? The chilling details of their behavior led many to question their mental state. Were the Alexander brothers truly acting out of desperation, as their defense claimed, or were they more aware of what they had done than they let on? It was as if they had been playing a game all along, one where the stakes had simply become too high. The brothers had worked for years to build their empire, and yet in a single night, it all fell apart. As the case continued, the media was relentless. Every new detail, every new piece of evidence was seized upon and sensationalized. News outlets, desperate for clicks, turned the Alexander brothers into the poster children for the dark side of wealth and privilege. Social media exploded with opinions, with some condemning them as ruthless criminals, and others arguing that they were simply the victims of a society that had placed too much pressure on them. The public was divided, and each new revelation only fueled the fire. Then came the shocking twist in the case: the Alexander brothers' plea for bail. Their defense team, confident that they could sway the judge, argued that they were not a flight risk. They presented their social status, family ties, and past community involvement as evidence of their stability. But the public was unconvinced. Many believed that the brothers had already shown their capacity for violence, and the idea of them being granted bail seemed unimaginable. The case was already a public spectacle, and with their plea for bail, the brothers only seemed to draw more attention to their situation, further igniting the flames of public outrage. By now, the Alexander brothers had become infamous, not just for the brutal crime they had committed, but for the way they had handled the aftermath. Their desperation for bail, their apparent indifference to the crime, and the mounting evidence of a toxic, dysfunctional family dynamic had placed them at the center of a media storm. The questions surrounding their motivations, their guilt, and their future remained unanswered. But one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same again. As we look back at the rise and fall of the Alexander brothers, we're left to wonder, were they merely victims of their own privilege, or is there something darker at play here? What pushed these men, once seen as the epitome of success, to the brink of violence? Were they driven by financial ruin, a lifetime of repressed emotions, or something more sinister? And as their fate hangs in the balance, we must ask ourselves, how much responsibility should the powerful truly bear for their actions? Let me know what you think. Do you believe the Alexander brothers are guilty of a crime of passion, or was there something more planned and calculated? Should they be granted bail, or should they face the consequences of their violent actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss this disturbing case further. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of real-life crimes and mysteries. We're building a community of individuals who are not afraid to dig deeper into the truth. The trial had become an emotional battleground where every piece of evidence, every word spoken, was analyzed and dissected under the unblinking eyes of the media and the public. The Alexander brothers, once icons of wealth, power, and success, were now under scrutiny like never before. The courtroom was a silent witness to their unraveling as the prosecution and defense clashed over how the brothers should be perceived and what justice should truly look like. As the case progressed, one fact became chillingly clear: the brothers had no intention of taking responsibility for the horrific crime they had committed. Their defense continued to argue that they were not fully accountable for their actions due to the immense pressure they had faced in the months leading up to the murder. They claimed that years of maintaining their family's business empire, coupled with personal struggles, had driven them to the breaking point. In their eyes, they were victims of circumstance, trapped by the very wealth and success they had worked so hard to build. Daniel's defense team painted him as a man who was simply trying to hold it all together. The pressure of running the family business, they argued, was immense. With the company on the brink of financial ruin, Daniel felt like he had everything to lose. As the face of the Alexander legacy, the burden of failure weighed heavily on him. He felt responsible not only for the family fortune but for his brother's future as well. This constant stress had made him unpredictable, and the defense argued that it clouded his judgment during the fateful dinner party. They claimed that the fight was the culmination of months, even years, of built-up frustration and fear, leading to an unfortunate and irreversible eruption of violence. But despite the defense's efforts to portray Daniel as a man overwhelmed by circumstances, the prosecution wasn't buying it. This wasn't an outburst of a man under pressure, the lead prosecutor said. This was a premeditated act of violence, one that was carefully executed in a moment of rage. The prosecution emphasized that while Daniel may have been under stress, he had been in control of his actions. The witnesses who had been at the dinner party confirmed that the brothers had been arguing fiercely long before things escalated to violence. There had been moments of tension between them, an undertone of animosity that had been festering for some time. The prosecution also pointed out the chilling nature of their behavior after the crime had occurred. When the police arrived at the Alexander mansion, they found the brothers eerily calm, almost as if they were detached from the gravity of the situation. There was no immediate panic, no genuine remorse, only a cold, calculated response to the chaotic scene around them. This, the prosecution argued, was further proof that the attack was not a spur-of-the-moment act of self-defense, but something far darker. As the trial continued, the Alexander brothers' past began to unravel. For years, they had been seen as the epitome of success, untouchable, admired, and envied. But now every aspect of their personal and professional lives was under intense scrutiny. Investigators and journalists dug into their business dealings, their relationships, and their personal struggles. The public learned of their growing debts, their troubled relationship with their family, and their internal power struggle. Thomas, once a carefree figure living in his brother's shadow, had grown increasingly resentful of Daniel's control over the family business. He had dreams of his own, dreams that Daniel had either ignored or dismissed. Their relationship had deteriorated, and their professional rivalry had spiraled into personal animosity. Perhaps the most shocking revelation came when it was revealed that the Alexander brothers had been involved in a number of shady business deals. They had built their empire through a combination of risky investments and aggressive tactics that left many in their wake. Some of their closest business associates testified that the brothers were not just ruthless, but willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. It was clear that their quest for power and wealth had come at a high cost, and it had created a poisonous environment within the family. Yet the defense continued to cling to the idea that the Alexander brothers were simply victims of a broken system. They had been raised to believe that they were invincible, that nothing could harm them, and that wealth and status would always protect them from the consequences of their actions. The pressure to maintain this facade had slowly eaten away at their mental health, leaving them feeling trapped and helpless. They didn't know how to get out, the defense team argued. They didn't have the tools to cope with the situation they had created. But many were unconvinced. The public outcry against the brothers' actions grew louder as more details came to light. How could two men who had everything, who were born with opportunities many could only dream of, commit such a crime? Was this really about stress, pressure, and mental health, or was it a deeper reflection of their moral decay? The emotional toll on the community was evident. The victims of this crime were not just the brothers' family and friends. They had hurt the very fabric of the community that had once supported them. As the trial neared its conclusion, emotions ran high in the courtroom. The victim's family, devastated by the loss of a loved one who had been caught in the middle of this violent altercation, spoke out. They shared their memories of the man who had been taken from them, a person who had known the brothers for years, someone who had trusted them. "We never thought it would end like this," the victim's siblings said, their voice trembling with grief. "They were supposed to be friends. They were supposed to be family." With these words, the courtroom fell silent. The reality of the crime, the betrayal of trust, and the horrific consequences of the brothers' actions were laid bare for all to see. It wasn't just a story about two men who had lost control. It was about the unraveling of a life, of an entire family, and of a community that had been shattered by their actions. The sentencing was the next step in this tragic tale. The judge, after listening to all the evidence and the emotional testimonies, handed down the verdict. Daniel and Thomas Alexander were convicted of second-degree murder. The judge's statement was short but powerful. The lives of two innocent people were taken in an act of senseless violence. While I understand the pressures you both faced, there is no excuse for what you did. Both brothers were sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt that it was a fair punishment given the circumstances, while others believed that the brothers should have received a harsher sentence. The victim's family expressed their disappointment, feeling that no sentence could ever undo the pain they had endured. They may have lost their freedom, "But we lost a piece of our family forever," the victim's mother said. "No amount of time behind bars can bring back what they took from us." As the brothers were escorted from the courtroom, they glanced back at the crowd. In their eyes, there was no relief, no remorse, only the cold, empty realization that they had thrown everything away. Their future was uncertain, and the life they had once known was gone forever. What was left for the Alexander brothers now was a long road ahead, one that would be defined by their actions, their guilt, and the prison sentence that awaited them. What do you think? Were the Alexander brothers justified in their actions considering the stress and pressure they were under? Or do you believe they should have faced a harsher sentence? Should we hold people with wealth and power to a different standard of accountability? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss whether the justice system really met the needs of the victim in this case, and if the Alexander brothers truly deserve redemption. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe. By joining this community, you'll stay up to date with real-life cases that explore the darkest corners of human nature. Your voice matters, and together, we can keep asking the tough questions that need answers. As the dust settled from the trial, the case of the Alexander brothers continued to haunt the public consciousness. While they had been sentenced to a lengthy prison term, the broader questions about wealth, privilege, and justice lingered in the air. Was this a crime committed by two men under overwhelming pressure, or did it represent something much deeper, a darker truth about the elite and the price of power? In the wake of the brothers' conviction, a fierce debate raged online, with opinions sharply divided. Some argued that Daniel and Thomas had been crushed by the weight of their success. Too much responsibility, too much fear of losing their status, and an inability to cope with the mounting stress. They were never given the tools to handle pressure, one commenter wrote. Wealth doesn't solve mental health problems. We should be looking at how society fails people, even those with money. Others, however, weren't so sympathetic. They were entitled and had no regard for anyone but themselves, one critic said. Just because they had everything doesn't mean they had the right to take someone's life. Their wealth shouldn't have saved them from accountability. These kinds of debates reflected the underlying anger that many felt toward the brothers. The perception that they had everything and still destroyed so much left a bitter taste in many mouths. But was the crime truly about greed and power, or was it more a case of toxic masculinity and unresolved familial trauma? The Alexander brothers were raised in an environment that demanded perfection, where success was the only acceptable outcome, and failure was a fate worse than death. Their family history had set them up for a life where emotions were suppressed and ambition was the sole measure of worth. The pressure to maintain this facade eventually shattered them. Both men were products of a system that forced them to climb higher and higher, never allowing them to express vulnerability or weakness. Their inability to handle failure led them to lash out, to destroy everything they had worked for in a fit of violence. Yet when it came time to face the consequences of their actions, their true colors were exposed. The cold, almost detached manner in which the brothers reacted to their situation sent a chilling message. Were they truly remorseful? Or did they simply feel entitled to continue with their lives as if nothing had happened? Their desperate plea for bail, made even after the full scope of their crime had come to light, left many questioning whether they understood the gravity of what they had done at all. The sentencing was seen as a critical turning point in the public's perception of the Alexander brothers. While some felt that 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole was an appropriate sentence for two men who had taken another's life so casually, others argued that the brothers should face more severe punishment. After all, their wealth and status had shielded them for so long. Was 30 years enough to account for the trauma they had caused, not only to the victim's family but to society as a whole? Would they be able to pay the price for their crime in a way that truly reflected the damage they had caused? This was where the conversation shifted. Should justice be blind to wealth and power, or should the elite be held to an even higher standard? The Alexander brothers had grown up with everything they could ever need: access to the best schools, the finest medical care, and a life of privilege. So when they committed a brutal crime, was their sentence truly reflective of their guilt? Or did the public feel that they had not suffered enough because of their wealth? Was the trial, with all of its drama and media attention, just a facade, a performance to ensure that justice was served? Or was it truly a fair representation of how the law should treat those who have everything but lose it all through their actions? Some argued that the brothers had been given a life sentence of their own, a public downfall so severe that their reputation was beyond repair. They would never again walk in the same circles, never again be viewed as the untouchable elite they once were. Their crime has destroyed everything they worked for, one commenter noted. That's worse than any prison sentence. But then there were those who believed the brothers were only getting what they deserved, a taste of the consequences of a life lived with entitlement and arrogance. Their wealth, their power, and their connections had shielded them for too long, and now they were being held accountable in the court of public opinion. This was, for many, the ultimate justice, not just the prison sentence, but the public humiliation, the loss of everything they had built. Their wealth no longer offered protection. They had crossed a line, and the public had no sympathy for those who used their privilege as a shield against the law. The case left many wondering, how many people live in the shadows of this kind of privilege, hiding dark secrets behind a facade of success? How often are we blinded by wealth and power, overlooking the fact that the people who seem to have it all might be struggling just as much as those with nothing? The Alexander brothers had been masters of maintaining their image, but in the end it was their own unraveling that made them infamous. It was a stark reminder that behind every polished exterior, there can be a mess of problems, fears, and emotions that, if not addressed, could lead to a breaking point. So what do you think? Did the Alexander brothers get what they deserved, or should they have faced more serious consequences for their actions? Was their wealth and privilege a factor in their crime, or were they just victims of a toxic environment? Can we truly separate someone's wealth from their guilt, or should their privilege have weighed even more heavily in determining their fate? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a discussion. Your opinion matters, and together, we can dive deeper into the questions this case raises about justice, power, and accountability. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. By joining this community, you become part of a space where we explore real-life mysteries, ask the tough questions, and continue to learn and grow together. This is more than just a channel. It's a conversation that includes all of you. So let's keep it going. Let's talk about the tough topics. And remember, we can make a difference through the conversations we have. Thank you for being a part of this journey. See you in the next video.